Hello everyone, Luke here, and today I'm going to be telling you guys about the biggest rivalry in gaming history, the PlayStation 3 versus the Xbox 360. It was one of the most debated console wars of all time, even to this day. There's still arguments as to who won, so what actually happened? Well, today I'm going to break it down. Now, I hate talking politics, so I'm going to try and be as unbiased as I can. So, let's get into what actually happened. Now, what even is a console war? Well, a console war is when two or sometimes more consoles release around the same time and are comparable with both positives and negatives. Video game consoles are pretty expensive, so let's say you bought an Xbox and your friend bought a PlayStation. You don't want to say that your friend who bought the PlayStation made the better purchase. No, you want to defend what you bought because these things can get pretty expensive. One of the most infamous console wars was the Super Nintendo versus the Sega Genesis. Nintendo and Sega had a very hated relationship with each other back in the 90s. Before Sega made the Genesis, Nintendo was on top of the world. So when Nintendo made the Super Nintendo, Nintendo expected the sales to be crazy, but in came Sega and stole a lot of sales Nintendo would have had otherwise. The Xbox 360 versus PlayStation 3, it was more of kind of a friendly competition. With Sega versus Nintendo, they were out for each other's blood. So, after the whole Sega Nintendo thing, Sony decided to give a go with the PlayStation 1 in 1994. And what a perfect time to do so. Nintendo wouldn't release their first 3D console a whole 2 years after the PS1 came out, and they chose to stick with cartridges instead of the normal discs. So by the time the Nintendo 64 came out, Sony already had a 2-year head start on Nintendo. And Sega is Sega, so of course they flopped. With all the circumstances, I think it was obvious that the PS1 was going to win this generation, but I don't think people really knew how much it was going to be by. The PS1 sold over 100 million units. Which honestly is a good example for when a new generation of systems starts, it's unclear who will come out on top. So Microsoft thought why not, and they made the Xbox. Now, they were going up against the Nintendo GameCube and the PlayStation 2. Yeah, Sony was on top of the gaming world. Everybody knew what a PlayStation was. And the fact that you could play DVDs without any additional add-ons only boosted sales. It's actually wild how much the PS2 sold, but when you look at it, it's actually pretty clear why. Microsoft, I guess they got second, but when it's over a 70 million difference, I think it's kind of hard to give something like this to you. No, the Xbox didn't do bad at all, selling 24 million units, even beating out Nintendo. They still got smoked by Sony, so this is normally when a company would stop making game consoles. But, I mean, this is Microsoft, they have infinite money, so of course they were going to give it another go. Introducing the 7th generation of consoles. Now, where was Nintendo in all this? Gone. They focused their attention over on the Wii, which wasn't competition with Sony and Microsoft anymore. The Wii was kind of its own thing. The Nintendo DS and PSP were both handhelds, so they were competing against each other, so they'll have two systems and two companies, Sony and Microsoft, to battle it out. Now, Sony of the development during their next console, they were cocky. I think anybody would be if their last system sold 150 million. They just needed a bit more developing time with their next console, which to them was fine. They could give Microsoft a head start, which would make it even more embarrassing if they lost. On May 12th, 2005, Microsoft announced their next console, the Xbox 360. Weird they skipped 359 numbers, but here we are. Microsoft was determined to make the Xbox 360 a massive deal, something Sony should have been scared of. Sony announced their next system, the PlayStation 3, more of a logical name than the Xbox 360. Sony showed how this was a super powerful system with a thing called the Cell Processor. This was the first time people really saw next generation graphics. However, it was pretty hard for programmers to learn, but for Sony it didn't matter. They thought that programmers would take all the time to learn it because everybody knows what a PlayStation is. Programmers would take all their time working on a PlayStation 3 game, then port it over to the Xbox 360. That was the goal. They wanted the PS3 to be the ultimate game system. Backwards compatibility, they could play the new Blu-ray discs, which were far more impressive than DVDs. Sony was determined to make the most impressive piece of hardware ever, something that people would buy no matter the cost, no matter the cost. The PS3 reveal was messy, just the way the lines were delivered and such, but it was looking promising, until the cost was shown at $599, which is about $932 in today's money, which, if you're wondering the moment when thousands lost trust in the PlayStation brand, this is the moment. And the delays. The PS3 was eventually pushed to spring of 2006 and then to holiday of 2006. So by the time the PS3 came out, the Xbox 360 already had a year head start of games and a player base, which is important because this is around the time when online gaming started to take off. Which, if you think back, the PS1 beat the Nintendo 64 for this very reason. That reason being Sony had a 2-year head start on Nintendo. As they said, history often repeats itself. And the marketing didn't help. Have you ever seen a PS3 commercial? They were really weird, which I think is Sony getting cocky. Like, oh, we made the PS2. We can make our commercials as weird as we want because people will buy our systems regardless. By the time the PS3 came out, nobody cared. It had no games, no player base. The PlayStation 3 became the system that everybody laughed at. And the Xbox 360, it was easier and cheaper to develop for. So most of the time, developers would make a game for the 360, then just port it over to the PlayStation 3. Not to mention Halo, that game was huge and it was only on Xbox. The PlayStation 3 was a failure at the start of its life. Sony went from being the king of the video game industry to being something that everybody laughed at within 5 years. So while Sony was struggling, that didn't mean Microsoft didn't have problems. Infamous Red Ring of Death. If you saw this on your system, I salute you. It pretty much meant that your system was. And the Xbox 360 just broke down a lot, which actually costed Microsoft a lot of money in repairs. Later down the system's life, they would figure it out, but your Xbox 360 wasn't perfect. I mean, it didn't matter. You still had amazing releases almost every single month. And it all built up to Halo 3 on September 25th, 2007. And then Microsoft kind of gave up. Not saying they were done altogether after that, but all the big 360 games came out before Halo 3. Microsoft worked on making sure the 360 didn't break every other week, but they took their cash and they were satisfied with where they were at. So while Microsoft gave up, Sony didn't. After Halo 3's release and Microsoft's victory, Sony really gave it their all. They cut out unnecessary features like the backwards compatibility to cut costs, making the PS3 cheaper. They got some more developers to make games and made a few great games themselves, one of them being The Last of Us. Many people bought a PS3 just for this game. And remember, we were still at a point where Xbox 360s were breaking left and right. The PlayStation 3 went through some revisions, making it way cheaper. They got better marketing. They really gave it their all to make the PlayStation brand something people can trust again. And in the end, against all odds, the PlayStation 3 ended up selling 87.4 million units, about 3 more than the Xbox 360. Which, wow, the double underdog story. The underdog of the underdog ended up winning. I still see people debating about who really won because both consoles have their ups and downs. So, which system do I think is better? Well, I'm going to compare them. There are going to be 5 categories: games, fanbase, graphics, cost, and other features. Whichever system gets the most points wins. Games. The PS3 had an amazing exclusive games like The Last of Us, Gran Turismo, Metal Gear Solid, God of War. Meanwhile, the Xbox 360 had Forza, Halo, and Gears of War. Now, Halo is massive, don't get me wrong. Halo back in the days is equivalent to something like water today. It is just so popular. But other than Halo, you really don't have that much. The PS3 just had a larger variety of games. I mean, Microsoft still had Halo, so it's really just down to preference, but I think I'm going to have to give this one a tie. They both get a point because their game selections both have their ups and downs. Fanbase. This is a hard one to judge, but I think the fanbase for the Xbox 360 was better. Remember, back in 2005, they were the underdogs, so when the PS3 initially flopped, it was a cool time for Xbox users. It was their first big win. A lot of the PS3 fanbase moved to the Xbox right away, dividing the player base. So I'm gonna have to give this one to Microsoft. Graphics. I mean, it's Sony, no explanation needed. Okay, maybe just a short one. The PS3 still holds up today as a good looking system, but back then, this was next gen stuff. I would like to mention that the Xbox 360 came out a year before, and the graphics on the 360 don't look quite as good as the PS3. However, the 360 was the first system to have next gen graphics, so while the PS3 still looked better and it still gets the point, the Xbox 360 coming out before the PS3 made the PS3 look not quite as revolutionary, as the 360 already looked good. But still, the PlayStation 3 gets the point here. Cost. I think the initial price point for the PS3 at the start of its life just loses its point here. I do admire how they made the PS3 cheaper. It was just too late. The Xbox from the start of its life was just more affordable for the start of its life. Xbox 360. Other features. The Xbox 360 could play DVDs and it could also stream shows, but the PS3, they really made the PS3 so it could do anything. I mean, you have the cell processor, HD resolution, motion sensors, a wireless controller, and a hard drive that eventually grew to 500 gigabytes, and so much more. Sony gets the point. And the winner is, it's a tie. I hate when these things happen. So I'm just going to flip a coin to decide. Well, I guess the answer is just never meant to be known by humans. All the consoles of the 7th generation of consoles have their ups and downs. If you're looking by initial success, price point, and player base, the 360 won. If you're judging by graphics and other features, then the PS3 won. It's all just how you look at it. So, for my personal opinion, who won the 7th generation of consoles is the Nintendo Wii. It was the underdog the whole time.